These are some of the most heartbreaking stories in football history, starting with the most recent incident on this list because football stood still when one of the most loved players in the Premier League tragically lost his life. At just 28 years old, Diogo Jota was at the peak of his powers. He had just lifted the Premier League trophy with Liverpool and the Nations League trophy with Portugal. And if life couldn't be any better on the pitch, he had finally married his high school sweetheart Ruth Cardosa, who was also the mother to his 3 children, Dennis, Duarte, and Laura. Meaning for a rare moment in life, everything felt perfect, and he fought his whole life to get to this position. As Jota started his career in Portugal before getting his first big move to Atletico Madrid, they loaned him to Porto, then English side Wolverhampton Wanderers, where Jota would make a name for himself, as his goals would fire Wolves back into the Premier League and then into Europe. His consistency, hard work, and talent finally caught the attention of Jurgen Klopp at Liverpool, as he brought him into the club where he instantly made an impact. In the 2021-22 season, he scored 21 goals as Liverpool won the FA Cup and League Cup, whilst finishing second in the Premier League and reaching the Champions League final. Now, Jota wasn't just loved on the pitch because he was also a strong part of the gaming community, actually one of the best FIFA players in the world, truly making him a fan favorite in the footballing world. Come 2025, and his football career reached its peak as he finally won the Premier League with Liverpool, playing a strong part in the team that year. But his commitment was deeper than just goals and assists, because that season he was playing with a serious injury and had kept putting off surgery, playing through the pain so that he could help Liverpool finally win the title. Nobody knew at the time, but Diogo Jota had been playing with a collapsed lung. So that summer, after marrying his childhood sweetheart in a ceremony with friends and family in Portugal, he had a much-needed operation to fix his lung. The operation was a success, but it meant he was not allowed to fly, so he was told he had to take the ferry back to Liverpool with his brother Andre Silva. His brother was also a pro football player, and the two of them were very close, so they decided to drive back to the ferry together, and this is where the heartbreak occurs. They decided to drive at night as it was cooler, but shortly before a planned overnight stop, Jota's Lamborghini blew out its tire while overtaking at high speed and crashed, killing both Jota and Andre on impact. This came just 1 week after his wedding day, where his final post to the world was a video surrounded by friends, family, and his 3 children, captioned, "A day we will never forget." After his death, the entire footballing world stood still. Liverpool retired Jota's shirt number 20, and players and fans around the world paid tribute to Jota, with many of his former teammates showing their respect for Jota by pretending to play video games whenever they scored. Jota was buried alongside his brother in a church in his hometown, so that in death as in life, he will never walk alone. A player passing at the peak of their powers is truly awful, but what about an entire team passing away in one of the saddest stories in football history? You see, for this, we have to roll the clock back a few years to the late 1950s, when Manchester United had arguably the most talented side in all of Europe. I mean, this wasn't a team of high-profile, big-money signings, but instead a group of exciting young players who had just won the league back-to-back and were expected to dominate European football for the next decade, led by manager Sir Matt Busby, with talents like Bobby Charlton and Duncan Edwards in the side. This team were known as the Busby Babes and were on track to lift their first ever European Cup, as they had just drawn 3-3 away to Red Star Belgrade to secure their spot in the semi-final. But as this match ended, nobody could have predicted quite what a tragedy was about to unfold. They flew back from Belgrade and had to stop the plane in Munich to refuel, but the plane's engines had some issues, to the point that 2 attempts to take off were aborted, and by that time it had started to snow, covering the runway with slush. It looked like the players would spend the night in Munich, and Duncan Edwards even sent a telegram to his landlady saying all flights were cancelled, but the pilots made the fateful decision to try to take off one more time so that the team could stay on schedule with league matches. But as the plane accelerated down the runway, it once again was unable to reach fast enough speeds to take off. But this time, the plane was going too fast to abort the takeoff, skidding off the runway and crashing into a house. In an instant, 20 passengers had lost their lives, 7 of whom were Manchester United football players. Duncan Edwards survived the crash, but unfortunately died 15 later in the hospital, and 2 further Manchester United players were left so badly injured that they could never play football again. Bobby Charlton was one of the survivors of this crash who experienced what could only be described as a miracle as he swapped seats in between takeoff attempts, quite literally being the difference between life and death. After a tragedy like this, surely the players, the manager, and the club as a whole should have faded into nothingness, but these men were not quite ready to give up. Over the course of the next decade, Manchester United rebuilt and somehow returned to European football as Bobby Charlton lifted the European Cup in the greatest comeback story in sports history. He also lifted the World Cup and even the Ballon d'Or as both Bobby Charlton and Manchester United turned the worst night in their club's history into fuel to honor the ones who did not make it out alive. Now, not every heartbreaking story has to be about death, because in 2010, the hearts of an entire continent were well and truly broken as one man cheated to literally destroy the hopes and dreams of every boy in all of Africa. The story takes place at the 2010 World Cup hosted by South Africa, and at that time, no African nation had ever made it to the semi-finals of the tournament. Come the quarterfinals, only one African nation remained, with that being Ghana, so the entire continent was behind them as they were drawn against Uruguay, whose main man was none other than Luis Suarez. And this version of Suarez was ruthless to say the least, with disciplinary issues coming left and right, but he was about to experience the most hate he would ever receive in his entire career. Ghana started the game on the front foot and took the lead with an absolute screamer by Sully Montari, but Uruguay soon equalized through Diego Forlan. The game went to extra time, and in the 120th minute, Ghana thought they had won the game as Dominic Adiyea headed the ball toward the net, but Luis Suarez, standing on the goal line, had other ideas and just stretched his arm and used his hand to stop the ball from going in. He wasn't even trying to hide his cheating in what was a clear-cut act of bad sportsmanship, and of course, Suarez got a red card. Ghana were handed a penalty, and the entire African nation sat and watched as the player ran up and hit the ball hard, beating the keeper, but instead of rattling the net, it pinged off the bar. At that moment, Suarez started celebrating, knowing that his cheating had probably won Uruguay the game, and he was right as they went on to win the penalty shootout, eliminating Ghana. Suarez gloated and mocked Ghana in the media, saying he made the save of the tournament, and even comparing himself to Diego Maradona by saying, "The hand of God belongs to me now." Just like that, African hearts were shattered, and Suarez became the devil to an entire continent. Now, big tournaments like the World Cup are full of moments when everyone holds their breath, but this next story had the entire stadium in a state of shock as this football player almost died on the pitch. This takes place in 2021, where Denmark are playing their opening game in the Euros in front of a home crowd in Copenhagen, a huge occasion for the small nation to be playing a major tournament game on home soil, and they were expected to win against Finland, so the crowd went to the match full of optimism, but in the 42nd minute, everything changed. Denmark's star player Christian Eriksen was about to receive a throw-in when he just collapsed on the pitch. The world looked on in horror as time seemed to stand still. Denmark captain Simon Kjær acted quickly and put Eriksen in the recovery position before paramedics with defibrillators ran onto the pitch to treat him. He was rushed to hospital, and Danish fans held their breath until news reached them an hour later that he had stabilized. It was later confirmed that he had a heart attack and had to be fitted with an ICD defibrillator device, but thankfully he had survived. Now, Eriksen was an Inter Milan player at the time, but his future as a football player looked in serious doubt, especially because Serie A rules meant he couldn't play in with a defibrillator. So Inter Milan ripped up his contract as it looked like his career was over. But in a twist of fate, it turned out Eriksen could still play in England, and despite the world of football doubting his health status, he joined Premier League side Brentford before making a sidewards move to Manchester United, and almost a year after the heart attack, Eriksen returned to the national team to a hero's welcome, even scoring within 2 minutes of his return, proving a happy ending to a heartbreaking story. But the thing is, Eriksen was probably closer to dying on that pitch than people like to admit, because he wasn't the first player to experience something like this, except this time, the player would not be so lucky to make it out alive. Think about this. One moment, you could be arguing with the referee. The next, you're keeling over and your life is gone. And that summarizes the tragic tale of Hungarian striker Miklos Fer, whose life was tragically cut short at just 24 years old. The more you look into this, the sadder it gets because Fer was a player on the up. After making the switch from Porto to Benfica, the 24-year-old Hungarian international was finding some form till he was placed on the bench for an away game against Vitória de Guimarães before he was given the chance off the bench, getting an assist for Benfica's only goal of the game. At this point, Fer looked completely healthy, and just the month before, he underwent extensive medical tests, including an electrocardiogram on his heart, and nothing abnormal was found. But as Benfica were hanging on for the win on this rainy January night, Fer seemingly slowed the game down and was even given a yellow card by the referee for time wasting. He smiled coyly at the referee, knowing he had taken a booking to help his team and knowing the final whistle was moments away, but that would be the last image of him alive, as suddenly he simply bent over before collapsing on the wet turf. Teammates screamed for help, and paramedics rushed onto the pitch to perform CPR, but it was to no avail, as Fer was later pronounced dead from a heart attack. This was devastating. Nobody could believe what had just happened. How could a player die so suddenly, so young, and seemingly so healthy? Fans speculated, and even some made dark claims about drugs or steroids, even though an autopsy later proved those rumors to be completely false. It eventually came out that he died from hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is a hidden heart condition that could literally happen to anyone at any moment, proving how precious life can really be and how a single moment in football can change everything. And whilst there was no death involved in this next story, this football player lost everything in just one moment, as with just one miss kick, he went from the most loved player in his entire country to the most hated. When FIFA named its player of the century, this next guy was fourth on the list, ahead of the likes of Franz Beckenbauer, Zinedine Zidane, and Johan Cruyff. He had been named FIFA Player of the Year and won the Ballon d'Or, yet he suffered the cruelest fate of being remembered best for one missed kick. Roberto Baggio is truly one of the greatest players of all time, being ranked by FIFA as the fourth best player of the 20th century, but yet he is now remembered as the man who died standing. Baggio began his career setting Italian football alight at Fiorentina before making the move to Juventus in 1990 for what was a world record £8 million transfer fee. Fiorentina fans loved him so much that there were riots on the streets of Florence when he left the club. Il Divino Codino, as he's known, or the Divine Ponytail for his unique hairstyle, would go on to glory with Juventus, where he won the Serie A, the Coppa Italia, and the UEFA Cup, and his performances in 1993 were so impressive that he won the Ballon d'Or, and many people, including the likes of Fabio Capello, regard him as the greatest Italian footballer of all time. But he will always be remembered for one kick that went wrong on the world's biggest stage. He entered the 1994 World Cup as one of the game's top stars, as the current Ballon d'Or holder at the time of the tournament and Italy's undoubted talisman. But after a slow start in the group stage, Baggio showed his class in the knockouts, scoring twice against Nigeria and once against Spain, before netting 2 more times against Bulgaria in the semi-finals to give him 5 goals in the tournament, 1 short of the Golden Boot winners. But in the final against Brazil in Los Angeles, everything went wrong. He had been the tournament's most outstanding player, but he couldn't add to his tally as the two giants of 1990s football ground each other to a stalemate. The game and the World Cup would be decided by penalty kicks. Both the opening penalty takers would miss, then the next 2 would score for each side. Massaro then missed for Italy, and Dunga converted for Brazil, giving them a goal advantage ahead of the final spot kick. If Roberto Baggio failed to score, Brazil would be the world champions. The world held its breath. Italy's number 10 started his run-up. The commentator shouted, "It's Baggio!" His penalty flew over the crossbar, and Italy lost the World Cup final. "I had dreamt of playing in a World Cup final since I was a little boy," Baggio said, "but I never thought it could end like that." Baggio never got over the penalty miss, as it became the most famous miss in football history and became one which is shown every 4 years whenever the World Cup comes around. It even made its way into the music video for the South Africa World Cup song, and unfortunately for Baggio, had he scored, he would probably be remembered in the same light as Pele or Maradona. But now, the penalty miss is what people think of first when they remember his career. But believe it or not, Baggio's miss was not the most shocking thing that happened at that World Cup, because there was something much more heartbreaking going on. But before I get to that, I need to tell you about the Champions League final that saw hundreds of fans injured in the stands and some even losing their lives. It was the 1985 European Cup final final, which saw European champions Liverpool take on a strong Juventus side starring Michel Platini, who was seen as the best footballer in the world at the time, but the events before kickoff meant that nobody would remember the scoreline. The match was due to take place in a crumbling old stadium in Brussels known as Heysel, a stadium that had failed safety inspections and was not suitable for the 60,000 supporters crammed into its dilapidated terraces for the game, and even a stadium that both Liverpool and Juventus had implored UEFA not to use. To make matters worse, in the 1980s, hooliganism was rife, especially amongst English fans, and going to football matches was genuinely dangerous, meaning opposing fans had to be kept far apart out of fear of violence among them. But UEFA decided that an area right next to the Liverpool fans was to be a neutral section, and many of those tickets ended up in the hands of Juventus supporters. Problem was that these two sections were only separated by a flimsy fence, and it wasn't long before the fans started to throw flares, bottles, and even stones. But things only escalated from here, as eventually Liverpool fans charged the fence, smashing it down with ease, meaning an all-out brawl was about to unfold. Juventus fans tried to flee, but they had nowhere to go. They ran toward a concrete wall, but with no escape, the fans by the wall were crushed, and the pressure was so much that the wall collapsed, burying and killing fans. The stadium erupted into a full-on riot, but somehow the match went ahead. UEFA officials knew that people in the stands had died, but the game played on nonetheless. Juventus won 1-0, but the players didn't know the scale of the tragedy that had unfolded. 39 people had died, crushed by the wall or by fellow supporters. 32 Italians, 4 Belgians, 2 French, and 1 Northern Irish fan, 2 children, and hundreds others injured. After this day, 14 Liverpool fans were charged with manslaughter. The police and security were also found culpable, and all English clubs were banned from Europe. But the issues on stadium safety were still not addressed because, believe it or not, it took another tragedy to occur in 1989 known as the Hillsborough disaster, where a crumbling stadium led to 97 Liverpool supporters losing their lives. After this, UEFA finally started to take stadium safety seriously, but it's a tragedy that this was at the cost of so many unnecessary deaths. Football really should never be a matter of life or death, but unfortunately for the final player on this list, it quite literally was, as one mistake on the football pitch is the reason he lost his life in the most tragic World Cup story in the history of football. This also happened in the 1994 World Cup, and the victim was Colombia's captain, Andres Escobar. Colombia opened their tournament with a 3-1 loss against Romania, and other results didn't go their way, meaning if they lost to the United States in their second group stage match, they would likely be eliminated from the World Cup. Center back Andres Escobar played for local club Atlético Nacional at the time, who he helped win the Copa Libertadores, and at this time, he was so good it was rumored that AC Milan wanted to sign him. He was clean and calm on the pitch to the point that he was given the nickname the Gentleman, and he was engaged to a dentist, Pamela Cascardo. They were to get married later that year. But in that do-or-die match against the USA, everything changed. In the 35th minute of the match at Pasadena's Rose Bowl, in front of 93,000 fans, a cross came in from John Harkes, and Escobar tried to stop it, but it deflected into his own net. The USA took the lead. They would eventually win 2-1. Colombia won their final game, but it wasn't enough, and they were eliminated. Escobar was distraught, but as the captain, he knew he had to address the nation. It's been a most amazing and rare experience. We'll see each other again soon, because life does not end here. Escobar returned home to Colombia, which, at the time, was not a safe place. There was a lot of cartel control, and apparently, there was the mafia betting big money on the World Cup, meaning Colombia's World Cup exit had some very dangerous people losing some real sums of money. 5 days later, back in his hometown Medellin, Escobar went to a bar before leaving and being confronted in a parking lot. He was shot 6 times, with the shooter saying "goal" for each shot. Escobar was left to bleed out, and despite later being found and taken to hospital, it was too late to save him. Aged 27 and with a bright future, Escobar was dead, killed for an own goal. The world was in shock, and 120,000 fans attended Escobar's funeral as the entire football world mourned the death of Andres Escobar.